continue tonight in Daniel's prophecy, Daniel chapter 4. Now, in my opinion, this is one of the most unusual accounts in the entirety of Scripture. When we talk about the book of Daniel, I say, what happened in Daniel? From kids on up, the first thing that comes to our mind is Daniel in the lion's den. What's the most familiar story? What jumps out of you from Daniel's book? And then, of course, we would say, the three Hebrew boys and the furnace of fire. We studied that last week in chapter 3. Those two things, we've already covered them, the most familiar. Maybe then, thirdly, we would say that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about that big image, that vision. We've already covered that. And so this story from tonight is still about Nebuchadnezzar, not nearly as known, but to me, in its own way, unbelievably fascinating. And here's the reason. You say, well, why don't people preach from here? I went through all of my notes tonight and I thought, well, what's the point of the story? And that might keep people from preaching from this text, I don't know. But let me say this, there's a point through the entire book. We see the sovereignty of God in this book so powerfully over the affairs of men. We see God's purposes upon Daniel through all of these kings and kingdoms, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians. He shows him the Greeks to come. He shows him in that dream, that image, the Roman Empire. Shows him the kingdom of Christ. Daniel lives out in old age, in captivity, in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is still in power as we come here tonight. Now, he's a wicked man, unbelievably wicked. Not just idolatrous. Much of the world has been idolatrous, and that's a terrible sin. You know, remember, he ordered his wise men, if they couldn't interpret his dream, it's bad enough that he ordered them to be killed. But you remember what he said? Cut them into pieces. Turn their houses, their homes into dunghills. And so anyone that's able to execute those kind of orders. And then, of course, after Daniel interprets, he says, oh, praise be Daniel's God, he's the greatest among gods. That's not a conversion. Then he turns pretty wicked again, and he wants to throw those Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire. When he sees the fourth man and they're delivered, once again he says, you know, their God, he's the greatest God. He's the greatest among all these gods that we worship. But I really believe in this story tonight, which encompasses a number of years, that God changes Nebuchadnezzar's heart. Sometimes we forget that in the story of Daniel because we see he's surrounded by so many wicked men. But there's evidence here of a change because God works it, and it's wrought by God. But what he does to do that is what makes the story so fascinating, so out of this world. Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel chapter 4, verse 1. Now, here in the beginning of this, understand, it's pretty universally agreed on. Daniel is recording the words of Nebuchadnezzar. Something he decreed or something he said. And that's the way it's written in the first person by the king. Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. I'm going to stop right there briefly and say, that doesn't sound like Nebuchadnezzar. If you read that again, that sounds like someone who has experienced, someone who knows. Because understand, he's declaring not God's, but the God. Our God, Daniel's God. The only true and living God. There is but one God. And he says, I think it's good to show. And so he's going to tell this story. He's going to recount the story of what has happened to him, is what has brought him to this place. That what God, as he says, has wrought towards me. How great are his signs. How mighty are his wonders. And he even declares his kingdom. Now that's a rough thing for someone like Nebuchadnezzar to do. Men love power. We may not realize it, but not any of us would handle it real well. And I know some are worse than others at it. Why do you think it is so many of the world's leaders are so corrupt? Why is it all of our politicians end up corrupt? It's because of what men do with power. And we see this in the Bible. We see this in history. We see this before our eyes in the day in which we live in. Men love power. Why does it even get to preachers? It gets to the clergy. It can get to people in the workplace. You think, man, they'd make a good boss. I'll promote that person. And you have lived long enough, some of you, to see what that does to some people if you put them in charge. Everybody wants to be in charge. That's why Paul wrote, my brethren, be not many masters, teachers, instructors, experts. Be not many masters, knowing we shall receive the greater condemnation. We're accountable for that sort of authority. I'll be honest with you, if you want to run the show, you probably won't do a good job running the show. I've found that to be true. That's not Bible, that's me. But Nebuchadnezzar, what I say is, he declares, and one of the threats, what was the threat to Herod? A king is born. I better kill the babies. What a wicked man. A king, I'm king. And so Nebuchadnezzar not only says that he has a kingdom, but here in these first 3 verses we read, he says his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. He's saying there's somebody bigger than me. There's somebody greater than me. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar? Daniel records these words. Nebuchadnezzar had another dream. A dream of the great tree. And once again, Daniel interprets. Let's read that. I don't have it printed in my tablet, so I'm going to read from the text. Good thing I got my good glasses. Begin in verse 4. Daniel chapter 4. And I want to read through verse 18 at this point. This is why Nebuchadnezzar's to this place. He tells us what happened. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house, and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, sound familiar, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. Then came in the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, and I told the dream before them. So he didn't forget it this time. He just wanted to know the meaning. I told the dream before them. But they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But at the last, Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, and no secret troubleth thee, tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen and the interpretation thereof. Thus were the visions of mine head. In my bed I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher, and an holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, Hew down the tree, and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beast get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beast and the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation, but thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. So we're about to find out what this means, but here's the vision. So when Nebuchadnezzar is telling about these events, they have already taken place. He's telling what happened. And because it's very important. They've already taken place. And as I said, for some reason, this story, I don't remember studying it in Sunday school. But it's very, very remarkable. The king, we're going to see that God shows the king who it is that is absolutely in control of all of the affairs of mankind. By the end of this, Nebuchadnezzar knows that it is God that establishes kings, even sometimes from, as he says, the basest of men. Perhaps he had himself in mind when he says that. The recorded events that take place, that this prophecy foretells, do more to change the heart of this wicked king than any of the other spectacular experiences, miraculous experiences, and powerful experiences of his entire life. The circumstances of the dream are similar here to that of the earlier visions. This time the king knows the details of the night vision. He didn't forget what he dreamed this time. He only seeks the interpretation from all his wise men. And once again, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, all of the finest scientists and soothsayers, stargazers of the day, they don't try and make anything up. They're not able to give him an answer. Now, the Bible tells us the last one to come in is Daniel, and I don't know why that is. Because of what had happened previously. And even when Daniel comes in, he says, you're the best. I know you can do this. But he gives his men a chance. Notice this time he doesn't threaten to kill him. It's as if he believes he's going to get an answer when Daniel comes. Because God had been working through him already. I don't know why Daniel was called last. Men do that. We still do that. I guess I better try God. I've tried everything else. Better try God's man in this case, Daniel. In verse 8, Nebuchadnezzar calls him first by his Hebrew name. That's also powerful because he's writing this afterwards. And he says Daniel, who was known as Belteshazzar, the name he had given him. But that he acknowledges his Hebrew name, his name that associates him with the true God. But he does give the Chaldean name. Nebuchadnezzar realized how blessed he had been, and perhaps he realizes how much he had taken those blessings for granted. Where we began here for the second reading was in verse 4 when he starts this way, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house and flourishing in my palace. And that, after this vision, when it's fulfilled, that is all interrupted very suddenly. He says, I was at peace. I had everything. I was fat and flourishing. I was happy. Note that there are, as I said, no threats toward the wise men. The details of the vision of the great tree are recorded here in verses 10 through 18 that we just read. And Nebuchadnezzar recalls him. Not only does he remember it, but he recalls him with great detail and precision for Daniel. In the vision, an holy one cries for a watcher, sees this beautiful tree, producing fruit, providing shade, so mighty, so tall. The watcher cries for it to be hewn down, for it to be killed. Leaving a stump in the ground. I'll tell you, if you really want to remove a tree, and if God really wanted to remove Nebuchadnezzar permanently, he could have. Daniel understood this stuff. I only understand it because I've read Daniel's writings, but I understand that when Daniel heard that, leaving the stump in the ground, he realizes that God has some future intentions for this tree, for this king, as we'll see. These are key prophetic words concerning what was to happen to the king himself, whom the tree represented. The purpose of these events was so that, in quotes I have this, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. Let's read about the interpretation. Daniel gives the interpretation, but not until after he stands there in silence for an hour. He's in awe of what he's just heard and what he realizes this means. Verses 19 through 27. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. The king spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream of the interpretation thereof trouble thee. In other words, he's saying, go ahead and tell me. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. The tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. It is thou, O king, that art grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown, and reacheth unto the heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. And whereas the king saw a watcher and an holy one coming down from heaven, and saying, Hew the tree down, and destroy it. Yet leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, is in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. That they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven. And 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou knowest that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee, after that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. What a warning. What an interpretation. Daniel, as I said, stood in astonishment for an hour, seemingly reluctant to give the interpretation. I mean, the prophets sometimes had to deliver some pretty bad news. You might remember that Jeremiah was reluctant to. He said they're not going to receive this. God tells him, take no thought for their faces. Ignore the dirty looks that you get and speak my words. Daniel stands in astonishment for 1 hour, and the king tells him, tell me. Don't be afraid. Don't be troubled by it. He knows, he's got history already knowing that whatever Daniel says, good or bad, that it's very likely the truth. Daniel does not have to go home and pray this time to know what the dream means. He's still standing there. God gives him the interpretation. Men are not capable of doing this, but God is. And only by God's power could he do this. Daniel reveals that this great, fair, and mighty tree represented King Nebuchadnezzar himself. The tree, while standing, was a glorious thing, and it was standing at the time of the vision, at the time of this revelation. But the dream revealed something terrible that would come to pass. Nebuchadnezzar was to be driven from his throne. The kingdom would be preserved until he had gone through what he was going to go through, and that he knew then that God was God. This tree was a glorious thing. It says that Nebuchadnezzar was to be driven from his throne from among men, and to be with and living as a beast, as an animal, to have the mind of it. In other words, I'm going to say, he went out of his mind. He lost his ability to reason, to think. I mean, he became, we talked about in a sermon here recently about men as natural brute beasts, but this is more severe than that. Those around him would have said he was mad. He was crazy. No one tried to harm him when this happened, but his enemies, which he probably had many, were probably reveling in his condition. He went out of his mind. I don't know if there's another example in that God uses many things to deal with men and to show himself to men, many unbelievably magnificent things. He chastens, he judges, he used a whale, he's used fire. I don't know if there's another example where he drives someone literally to the mind of a beast. It says this would be for 7 times. Likely that is for 7 years. That's a long time. A long time. And then God would restore the king's mind. And we see that, by the way. We're going to read the text through. That he does. That it happens almost instantaneously. After 7 years, his mind comes back to him. But for this time, he's eating grass. He's living like an animal. He probably didn't shower for 7 years, didn't cut his hair for 7 years, didn't trim his nails, the things that animals do not do. You've watched Jungle Book. You've heard about maybe the boy that's based on, a true story. Mowgli, boy raised in the wild by the animals. But here's a grown man, a king. And he's probably had a pretty high intellect, even though he was a wicked man. Some wicked people have high IQs. That doesn't get you into heaven. But for 7 years he had the mind of a beast. The stump left in the ground was the promise of restoration once God had shown himself to him. Daniel charges Nebuchadnezzar here to change his ways. He doesn't make any undue promises, because sometimes the judgment of God is so sure, and he's just. And yes, men ought to repent. It's just like when people go before the law. Much of our court system, certainly not all of it, and certainly not all of it in the day we live in, but is patterned after biblical law. We try to make the best judgments we can. And there are people that go in before a judge and they're truly sorry for what they did. And they make promises that they'll never do it again, but the fact remains that they'll be sentenced to pay for a crime they've committed. He had not tasted of the grace of God. He had no real, genuine faith in God at this time. But Daniel does say that he should consider his ways, that perhaps by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. Because boy, we wonder sometimes, why do the wicked prosper? And he was prospering. He said, I was at ease in my house, in my palace. Daniel gives the interpretation, and then shortly thereafter, Nebuchadnezzar's telling this in hindsight. He tells us that what Daniel foretold comes to pass. Verse 28. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar at the end of 12 months. So it was a year later. He walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for my house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? While these words was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, an audible voice, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar. And he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. How long would your nails grow in 7 years? I can't keep up with mine. I clean them all the time, cutting them. I know I used to be a nail biter, and after I got COVID and quit biting my nails. I can't explain that. It was not even a mental decision. But now, I don't pay attention to them. The next thing you know, I can't even play the guitar because they're growing so fast. I did not know nails grew that fast, because for 50 years I was a terrible nail biter. My sister Barb taught me that. I blame her anyway. Could you imagine 7 years? They grew, it says, like the bird's claws. Verse 34. And at the end of the days, so 7 years, 7 times, we're assuming that's 7 years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. In a moment, I believe. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of men, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand, or say unto him, What doest thou? At the same time my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom. See that stump? And the roots were still in the ground. And excellent majesty was added unto me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment. And those that walk in pride he is able to abase. Oh my goodness, this man learned something. This is actually the last time we read about Nebuchadnezzar. The next chapter begins with this word, Belshazzar. And we'll talk about who he is next week. And so based only on his words, I believe that God changed this man's heart. When we think of Nebuchadnezzar, we think of an evil man, we think of a wicked man. And he was. And so was I. But it's very possible, very likely, based on what God did, God worked in him. We may see this man in heaven because God chose to change him. After 1 year's time, 12 months, the king is still lifted up with pride. He obviously hasn't changed his ways. He's walking around his palace and saying, look what I've done, look what I've done, look how great it is, look how great I am. And in the moment, he hears a voice from heaven. It's time. Do you remember that dream of the tree? It's time. And God repeats what's going to happen to him. King walking safely in the comfort of his palace and speaking proud. That's why at the end here, he rebukes the pride. He said God is able to change and show them that walk in pride. He is able to abase them. He's able to bring them low because he had experienced this. Is not this great Babylon that I have built? And people talk about what they've done. Me, look what I've done. He was driven from men. I don't believe there was any sort of insurrection. I don't believe there was any sort of coup. Because I don't believe it was in a physical sense. But it seems that Nebuchadnezzar became dumb as the beasts of the field are dumb. I love coming to church and preaching. It would be a waste of my time to go out to the cow pasture and preach to the cattle. They're not able to reason. I love my little dogs. Dogs are among the most intelligent animals. They say that horses are too. But that only goes so far. I realize all the time that my chihuahuas are not very reasonable. Sadly, most men aren't. But he became as a beast. No man can sit on a throne and rule over others when he cannot even reason as a man. The time of this condition was 7 years. During this time he ate with the animals. He didn't cut his hair. He didn't trim his nails. The things that those with the ability to reason do regularly and care for ourselves as rational and thinking individuals. No beast really grooms itself. This man whom God had exalted so highly was brought as low as a living man can be brought. At the end of 7 years, sort of this condition was his prison. And I believe he knew fully what had happened to him when he comes to his mind, serving this time for the crime of his pride. The time that God had determined was finished. God does a lot of things in sevens, doesn't he? Particularly in this book. The king was set free from the prison of his insanity, and he lifts up his eyes, and his mind comes to him, and his reasoning and his senses come to him, and he begins immediately to bless God and to praise God, and he goes back to his palace. And I think his subjects are probably in awe at what had happened. They knew what Daniel had said, and this happening should not have been a surprise to anyone. His mind comes back to him, and he declares. It doesn't matter what you declare, though. Declares that men ought to worship the true God. You could declare that today and it wouldn't cause this world by masses, no matter what authority you had or what position you had. While in the awful condition of his loss of reason, as I said, no enemies came to slay Nebuchadnezzar. We can only speculate on why. He certainly had enemies, but he was not a threat to anybody. He was a crazy man outside of the city. In the woods, in the timbers, down by the waters, living with the animals, with no sense or no reason. God's providential hand was working in the king's life, and there was a root still, a stump in the throne. This was God's hand. And the fact that his counselors and his lords sought unto him, he says that I was established in my kingdom. That was God's doing as well, because we know that God established kings and establishes kings. There was no man placed to forbid Nebuchadnezzar's return, and the return was the exaltation by God's hand. There is no reservation in Nebuchadnezzar's final recorded words from Daniel. We talk about testimonies here on Wednesday night. This is a spectacular, fascinating, and powerful testimony. There is no evidence in these words of his former pride. Pride is a terrible sin. It's a root sin. A lot of the sins we try and deal with in our life all the time, we never realize the root that gives them life. So often beneath them, beneath the multitude of the vices that we become obvious to us, is something like pride. He ends his last recorded words, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride, he is able to abase." He's able to break anybody. By the way, we need broken. He can break us and remake us for his own glory and his own will. We're going to pick up next week in Daniel chapter 5. As I said, it begins with this, Belshazzar. We'll read about another story. What's the other story from the book of Daniel?